Loneliness has its own weight in the desert. It sits on the shoulders like red dust, penetrates the bones like the cold of the dawn, and whispers truths that no man wants to hear. Here, where the horizon is lost between earth and sky, one learns that there are wounds that not even time can completely heal. Thomas Mitchell watched the three figures approaching his property from sunrise. Man had built his life in those barren lands with his own hands, lifting every plank of his house, digging every yard of fence, taming every inch of rebellious land. At the age of 52, he carried on his back the story of a man who had lost much and found little, but who still believed that the earth did not lie to those who knew how to listen to it. The morning wind brought with it the sound of weary footsteps and the creaking of old wood. They were three women, he realized now, walking slowly along the dusty road that cut through his property. They came from the east, where problems always came and rarely solutions. They carried small bundles and the stooped posture of someone who had walked much further than he should. The eldest walked ahead. His grey hair escaped from a faded handkerchief, and even from a distance Thomas could see the determination in his steps. She didn't look around. She didn't hesitate. I knew this kind of walk. It was the march of those who had no choice, only destination. The two youngest followed her in silence, one with her head down, the other watching everything around her with eyes that seemed to hold more questions than answers. Thomas left his cup of coffee on the porch and descended the 3 wooden steps that creaked under his weight. The sound echoed through the silent morning as a warning or a welcome. He still didn't know which of the two. The bay horse that grazed near the house raised its head, its ears attentive, as if it also felt that something was about to change forever in that forgotten part of the world. The sun rose slowly, painting everything with golden tones that made the dust dance in the air. Thomas adjusted his hat and waited. He had learned over the years that in the desert, things come in their time, and that trying to hasten the inevitable only caused more suffering. The women approached with the patience of someone who had lost everything except the hope of starting over. When they finally stopped in front of the fence of their property, Thomas could see that they were sisters. They had the same dark eyes, the same determined jawline, the same way of holding their heads up even when everything around them collapsed. The eldest stepped forward, and her words cut through the morning air like a promise or a prayer. The phrase she uttered would echo for months to come in Thomas Mitchell's memory, changing not only the course of his solitary life, but also the meaning of all that he had so carefully built in those lands where the wind never stopped blowing. Some words have the power to reconstruct entire worlds, even when uttered by voices tired of walking so much. The ranch that had been his refuge from the world was about to become much more than that. Thomas just didn't know that this would be the last day he would wake up alone in those lands, and that the loneliness that had defined him for so many years was coming to an end in a way he could never have imagined. The dust continued to dance in the air. The wind still whispered between the fence boards, but something had changed forever in that patch of desert where 3 sisters had arrived carrying nothing but the hope of starting over and the silent promise that some battles are best fought when one is not alone. The truth sometimes arrives dressed in despair, but it carries with it seeds of something much greater. Thomas Mitchell had learned to read people as he read the clouds on the horizon. He knew when they brought storm and when they promised relief. Those 3 women brought both. The eldest was called Margaret, and when she spoke, her voice carried the firmness of someone who had made difficult decisions and borne the consequences. He was about 40 years old, with prematurely grey-brown hair and hands that told the story of a lifetime of honest work. Her sisters were Sarah and Elizabeth, younger, but with the same direct gaze and the same dignity that bowed neither to poverty nor to fear. The bank had taken over the small farm where they had lived for 3 generations. The drought of the past 2 years, followed by the death of their father and loans that had piled up like storm clouds, had made inevitable what they had always feared. Margaret explained all this without tears, without self-pity, only with the clarity of someone who had accepted the facts and was now looking for solutions. Thomas listened in silence, leaning against the fence, watching as Margaret held her shoulders high as she told about the past few months. Sarah, the one in the middle, looked at the floor, her hands clasped as if she were praying. Elizabeth, the youngest, watched all around her with curiosity mixed with hope. She had not yet lost the ability to believe that things could get better. When Margaret had finished speaking, a silence stretched between them like a bridge they had not yet decided to cross. Thomas could hear the wind whispering between the fence posts, the gentle swaying of the trees near the well, the slow breathing of the horses in the corral. They were the sounds of a life he had built on his own, but which suddenly seemed incomplete. Thomas's estate was larger than he could care for on his own. There was enough land to plant, animals that needed constant attention, a house that echoed empty in the long desert nights. He had hired help sporadically, but never anything permanent. Loneliness had become his most faithful companion, but also his greatest burden. Margaret must have noticed something in her expression, because she stepped forward and offered what she called a fair deal. They would work in exchange for housing and food. Sarah knew medicinal plants and knew how to take care of sick animals. Elizabeth was skilled with sewing and home repairs. Margaret herself had grown up tending a farm and knew every aspect of rural life as if it were an extension of her own hands. Thomas watched the three sisters stand in the rising sun and saw something he had forgotten existed. He saw a family that remained together even when everything fell apart around him. He saw dignity in the midst of need, strength in the midst of vulnerability. He saw what he himself might have been if he had not chosen solitude as a refuge from the disappointments of the world. The decision formed in his chest as a silent certainty. It was not pity that he felt, it was recognition. Recognition that some opportunities come disguised as problems, and that sometimes helping others is the only way to help yourself. Thomas nodded and pointed to the house at the back of the property. There was a smaller building, originally planned to house seasonal workers, which he had never completely finished. With a few renovations and a lot of work, it could become a decent home for the three sisters. They could live there as long as they worked on the property, and he would finally have the help he needed to make that land produce everything it promised. Margaret smiled for the first time since they had arrived. It was not a smile of exuberant joy, but of deep relief and genuine gratitude. Sarah raised her head and for the first time looked directly at Thomas, as if she finally believed that perhaps there was hope. Elizabeth couldn't hide a wider smile, the first sign that underneath all that maturity, forced by adversity, there was still a young woman capable of dreaming of better days. Thomas indicated that they could leave their things on the main porch, while he showed them around the property and explained what needed to be done. As they walked through the land that would now be theirs too, he realized that for the first time in years, he didn't feel the familiar weight of loneliness pressing on his shoulders. The desert remained the same, but something fundamental had changed in the way he inhabited it. The work has a particular way of revealing people's character, not through words or promises, but through the constancy of small gestures, persistence in the face of difficulties, and the way someone treats details that no one else notices. Thomas Mitchell discovered this by observing the three sisters during the first few weeks on their property. Margaret would get up before sunrise. Thomas heard her moving silently through the small building they had made habitable by working together. When he went downstairs to start his morning chores, he already found fresh water in the horse's drinking trough and the eggs collected from the chicken coop. She didn't do these tasks to impress or to ensure her stay there. She did it because that was how she understood life, as a series of responsibilities that were fulfilled regardless of who was watching. Sarah had taken over the care of an orphaned calf that Thomas had been feeding with difficulty for weeks. The young woman had gentle hands and infinite patience. He managed to get the animal to accept milk in a way that Thomas had never been able to. More than that, Sarah seemed to instinctively understand when the other animals were not well. Several times he warned Thomas about problems that he would not have noticed until days later, sparing the lives of some cattle and avoiding damage that could have been serious. Elizabeth brought something that Thomas didn't know was missing in his life: domestic order. Not just cleanliness, but the feeling that each object had its correct place and that the house was a home, not just a shelter. She repaired clothes he had thought were lost, organized tools he had spent time searching for, and brought small touches that made a difference. Wildflowers in a tin jar, clean curtains on the windows, the smell of fresh bread replacing the odor of loneliness that had pervaded the house for years. But it was Margaret who most intrigued Thomas. She worked with a skill that spoke of years of experience, but there was something more. A way of observing the land, of touching the plants, of evaluating the conditions of the cattle that showed not only knowledge, but genuine love for rural work. She understood the land almost as well as he did, and sometimes Thomas found himself asking for her opinion before making important decisions about the property. Autumn has arrived with its cooler nights and shorter days. The harvest had been better than Thomas had hoped, largely due to the tireless work of the three sisters. There were times during the shared work when he completely forgot that this arrangement had begun as charity. The sisters were not employees or dependents. They were partners in a common enterprise of making that land produce and prosper. One evening, after a particularly long day repairing fences damaged by a storm, Thomas sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and realized that Margaret was doing the same thing on the porch of the smaller house. They stood there, each in their own space, watching the stars in shared silence. They didn't exchange words, but Thomas felt a connection he hadn't experienced in years, the sense that someone else understood the weight and beauty of that life in the middle of nowhere. It was during these silent nights that Thomas began to notice something changing within him. The loneliness that had been her companion for so many years was being replaced by something different. Not just the presence of other people, but the feeling of belonging to something bigger than himself. The property was no longer just his. It was theirs, all of them, in a way he had never imagined possible. Margaret was also changing. Thomas noticed that she smiled more, that her words came more easily, that the constant tension in her shoulders was diminishing. The worries she had carried for months about where they would live, how they would survive, whether they would be able to stay together as a family, were giving way to something resembling tranquility. For the first time since her father's death, she could plan beyond the next day. Sarah began singing while working. They were simple melodies that she had learned as a child, but that filled the air with a joy that Thomas had forgotten existed. Elizabeth laughed more, asking questions about the history of the estate, about the marks the years had left on the trees, about the animals Thomas had raised over the years. The property was coming to life in a way that went far beyond agricultural production. Winter was approaching, bringing with it the need for more intense preparations. There was wood to chop, repairs to make before the first snowfalls, provisions to stockpile. Thomas realized that for the first time in years, he did not fear the arrival of the harshest season, not just because he had help, but because he wouldn't face the cold months alone. One afternoon, while helping to carry timber into the shed, Margaret and Thomas worked side by side in comfortable silence. Their hands touched briefly as they reached the same board at the same time, and Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in so long that he'd forgotten what it was called. It wasn't just attraction, it was recognition, the feeling of finding someone who understood not only your work, but your way of seeing the world. Margaret must have felt something similar, because her eyes met his for a moment longer than necessary. They said nothing, there was no need. Some understandings come quietly, such as the change of the seasons or the growth of plants. They grow slowly, without haste, until one day you realize that they have always been there, waiting for the right moment to be recognized. Thomas spent that evening on the porch, watching the soft light coming from the window of the smaller house, knowing that Margaret was probably making the same plans for the next day as he was, thinking about the same needs of the property, worrying about the same details. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't planning alone. There was someone who shared not only his work, but his vision of the future. The night wind whispered through the trees, but it no longer carried the loneliness that had accompanied Thomas for so many years. It carried promises of future springs, of shared work, of a life that had found its natural rhythm through the presence of people who understood that the true value of a land is not only in what it produces, but in what it allows people to become when they work together for something greater than themselves. There are moments in a man's life when he realizes that everything he has experienced before was just preparation for something bigger. Thomas Mitchell discovered this one winter morning, when he woke up before dawn to find Margaret in the kitchen, preparing coffee for everyone with the naturalness of someone who had always belonged here. Winter had arrived in full force, bringing with it blizzards that transformed the property into a white and silent world. During the most intense storms, when leaving the house meant life-threatening, the two families would gather in the main house. It was in these moments that Thomas realized how irreversibly their lives had become intertwined. Sarah told stories she had learned from her mother, Elizabeth repaired clothes while humming old melodies, and Margaret organized everything with the quiet wisdom of someone who knew that a family works through small gestures of mutual care. Thomas watched all of this with a mixture of gratitude and something that took months to recognize as love. Not the sudden and dramatic love of the stories that are told, but the one that grows slowly, day after day, through shared work, shared concerns, comfortable silences, and the growing certainty that some encounters are destined to change everything. Margaret had become much more than a work partner. When Thomas made decisions about ownership, he naturally sought his opinion. When she suggested changes in the organization of tasks or in the distribution of resources, he listened not out of courtesy, but because he recognized in her a wisdom that complemented his own. They had developed a silent language made up of looks, small gestures, and a mutual understanding that needed no words. During a particularly heavy snowfall that lasted 3 days, they were all trapped in the main house. On the second night, when Sarah and Elizabeth were already asleep by the fireplace, Thomas and Margaret remained awake, watching the flames and talking quietly about plans for spring. It was then that Margaret spoke about her fears, not about the future of the estate or about practical matters, but about the possibility that this happiness was temporary, that someday they would have to leave again. Thomas was silent for a long moment, watching as the firelight danced on her face. When he finally spoke, his words came out with a certainty that he himself did not know he had. He told him that that property had been built by a lonely man who did not understand that a land only has meaning when it is shared. He said that she and her sisters were not guests or servants, but an essential part of that place, and that he could no longer imagine those lands without their presence. Margaret's words, when they came, were simple, but loaded with a meaning that changed everything between them. She said she also couldn't imagine another place to live, not only because they had found safety there, but because for the first time in years she felt truly at home. There was something about the way Thomas took care of the land, the respect she showed for every detail of rural life, the quiet kindness with which she had received them, which made her feel valued not only for what she could do, but for what she was. That night, as the storm raged outside, Thomas and Margaret crossed an invisible line that had existed between them for months, not through grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but through the quiet acknowledgement that they had found in each other something they thought they had lost forever, the possibility of building a life based on mutual understanding, shared work, and an affection that had grown naturally like the plants that sprout from the well-tended earth. Winter eventually gave way to spring, and with it came a period of intense work in preparing the fields for planting. Thomas noticed that Margaret was working beside him with a newfound tranquility, as if she finally knew that this land was truly hers. Sarah and Elizabeth also seemed to have found their own peace. Sarah developed a small medicinal plant garden that soon became known in the region, and Elizabeth began doing sewing work for other families in the area, bringing in a small but significant additional income. It was during the spring planting that Thomas realized how his perspective on everything had changed. The property that had once been his refuge from the world had become a solid foundation for something much bigger. He was no longer building just for himself, but for a family he had chosen, and who had chosen him in return. Every decision he made took into account not only his own needs, but the well-being of Margaret, Sarah, and Elizabeth. One afternoon in May, as they watched the first green shoots emerge from the dark earth, Thomas found the courage to talk about something he had been thinking about for weeks. He proposed to Margaret that they make official what already existed between them, not just the partnership at work, but the union of two people who had discovered that life was much better when shared. He suggested that they marry at the end of the summer, when the first harvest was complete, and they could celebrate not only their union, but all that they had built together. Margaret smiled in a way Thomas had never seen before, a smile that came from deep inside, charged with genuine joy and deep relief. His answer was that she had been waiting for him to ask this question, but that she was never sure if she would be welcome. He said yes, not only because he loved him, but because he saw in him a future worth building, a man who understood that the true value of life was in the people with whom one chooses to share it. Sarah and Elizabeth received the news with a joy that filled the house with laughter and plans. For them, marriage meant not only that Margaret had found happiness, but that her family had found permanent stability. Thomas would not only be brother-in-law, but chosen brother, someone who had proven through months of working together that he understood the value of family and was willing to protect and nurture it. Wedding preparations have become a project for the whole family. Elizabeth took over the making of Margaret's dress, using fine fabrics that Thomas made a point of buying in the nearest town. Sarah prepared a special garden of flowers that would bloom exactly at the time of the ceremony. Thomas worked on the final renovations of the main house, expanding it to comfortably accommodate all of them and creating spaces that reflected the new reality of a close-knit family. The wedding took place on a golden August afternoon, under an immense sky that stretched to the horizon. The preacher came from the city, as did some neighbors who had become friends over the months. But the true meaning of the ceremony lay in the way Thomas and Margaret looked at each other as they exchanged vows, with the deep recognition of people who had found not just love, but true partnership to face all the challenges that life might bring. When the preacher spoke the final words and declared them husband and wife, Thomas remembered the words Margaret had spoken when she first arrived at his estate. At that moment, they seemed like a distant promise. Now, with Margaret by his side, Sarah and Elizabeth smiling close and a lifetime of possibilities stretching out before them, Thomas understood that those words had become the purest truth. He would never be alone again. None of them would be. They had found something rarer than gold in the desert. They had found a chosen family, a love built on a solid foundation of mutual respect and shared work, and the certainty that some encounters are destined to change not only the course of a life, but the meaning of everything that is built from that moment on. The property that had been a man's lonely refuge had become a family's home, and under the immense sky of that desert that had witnessed so many stories of struggle and survival, now began the story of 4 people who had discovered that true wealth was not in the land they owned, but in the way they chose to inhabit it together. If you've made it this far, it means that you also believe in the power of stories that touch the heart. This channel is dedicated to bringing Wild West narratives that show the strength of family, true love and hope, even in the most difficult times. Sign up to receive more stories like this every week.